The family stands there in stunned silence, their faces a mixture of disbelief and frustration. The manager's words echo in their ears, "I'm sorry, but we're unable to serve you today." Each word lands like a heavy blow, leaving them grappling with a confusion they can't shake. It's not just about a meal anymore, it's about being made to feel invisible, as though their presence doesn't matter, as though they don't belong. As they turn to leave, the weight of the situation presses down on them. There's a sense of unfairness in the air, thick and suffocating, a reminder that sometimes people aren't treated equally. But something inside them begins to stir an urge to not let this moment go unanswered. They know they could walk away, forget it ever happened, but the sting of being denied something as simple as a meal is too much. It's not just about the food, it's about the principle of it all. The family makes their way to the car, still in disbelief, but there's a quiet determination beginning to grow within them. They don't know exactly what they're going to do yet, but they know they can't let this go unnoticed. Something inside them says this isn't just an isolated incident. This could be bigger than they ever imagined, and they have a choice now. They can let this moment define them, or they can use it as the spark for something greater. As they drive home, the atmosphere in the car is heavy. No one speaks at first, there's just the soft hum of the engine and the occasional sound of a deep breath being taken. But then, as if on cue, the youngest member of the family speaks up, breaking the silence. Are we really just going to let them get away with it? Their voice is quiet but firm, as though they've already made up their mind. The question hangs in the air, and for a moment, no one answers. It's not because they don't know what to say, but because they all feel it deep down, that same frustration, that same desire for something to change. It's clear they all feel the weight of the injustice. The family has always been a tight-knit unit, bound by love and respect for one another, and in that moment, each of them feels the unspoken bond that holds them together. This isn't just about what happened at the restaurant, it's about fighting for something much bigger than themselves. Finally, the father speaks, his voice low but steady. "No, we're not just going to forget this. We can't. This is bigger than just us, and we need to make sure they know that. We need to make sure the world knows." His words hang in the air, heavy with conviction. The rest of the family nods in agreement. The decision is made. They won't let this go unnoticed. But they know this won't be easy. They're up against a system that's built on old habits, on ingrained biases that have been passed down for generations. It's not going to be a quick fix. The road ahead will be difficult, and they know they'll face resistance. But they also know that they're not alone in this fight. There are others out there, countless others who have faced the same injustices, who have experienced the same hurt and discrimination. And together they can stand strong. They reach home, but even inside the safety of their walls, the tension still lingers. The family gathers in the living room, each of them processing the events in their own way. The silence speaks volumes, as they all reflect on the best way forward. They know they can't go about this the usual way. They need to do something that will get people's attention, something that will make sure this story is heard by as many people as possible. They start making plans. It's clear that they'll need support. They can't take on a battle like this alone. They begin reaching out to people in their community, sharing their story with friends, neighbors, and anyone who will listen. Slowly, word starts to spread. Some people are skeptical, unsure of what they can do, but others are outraged, just as the family is. Soon, there's a small group of people ready to stand with them, ready to help them take action. Days go by, but the family remains determined. They won't let the incident be swept under the rug. They know that the restaurant's actions weren't just a one-time occurrence, they were a reflection of something deeper, something that needs to be addressed. But as they prepare to take their next step, they realize the fight will be much harder than they first thought. The restaurant, meanwhile, seems to be going about business as usual. There are no signs of change, no apologies, no acknowledgement of the incident that occurred. The family's efforts to reach out to them are met with silence. It's as if the restaurant is pretending like nothing ever happened, hoping that the story will fade away, that people will forget. But the family isn't ready to let it go. They refuse to let the restaurant hide behind their walls of indifference. As the days pass, the family decides it's time to take the next step. They begin organizing a peaceful protest outside the restaurant, a way to show that they won't be silenced. Word spreads quickly, and before long, more people show up, standing together in solidarity. They hold signs, chant, and make sure their voices are heard. They want to send a clear message: what happened was wrong, and it cannot be ignored. But despite the growing support, the tension is palpable. The restaurant's staff are visibly uncomfortable. Some of the protesters are met with cold stares, and others are dismissed as troublemakers. It's clear that not everyone supports what the family is doing. But that only makes them more determined. They're not backing down. They know that change doesn't come easily, and they're willing to fight for it. But just as it seems like the momentum is building, something unexpected happens. The family receives an anonymous tip, a clue that could change everything. It's a piece of information that casts a whole new light on the situation. The more they dig into it, the more they realize that this restaurant's actions are part of a much larger, more insidious pattern. It's not just about one isolated incident, it's about a system that has been enabling this kind of behavior for years, maybe even decades. This new information sends shockwaves through the family, sparking a new wave of urgency. They know they need to act quickly, but they also realize that this could be much more dangerous than they initially thought. As they prepare to dive deeper into the investigation, they know they're stepping into unknown territory. The stakes have never been higher. And just as they're about to take the next step, an unexpected twist occurs that no one could have predicted. The very thing they've been fighting against begins to close in on them, threatening to stop them before they can even begin to expose the truth. What will they do next? How will they overcome the obstacles that stand in their way? The suspense is building, and with every new development, the family inches closer to a moment of truth that will either break them or push them to fight harder than ever before. The anonymous tip they received hung over them like a storm cloud. It wasn't just a hint or a vague rumor, it was a piece of solid information that could crack open everything they thought they knew about the situation. The more they thought about it, the more they realized how deeply they were wading into waters that could pull them under. The quiet corners of their community had always seemed peaceful, untouched by the kind of animosity that the world outside seemed to carry. But now, the truth was starting to unravel, and the ripples were spreading faster than they could keep up. The family gathered around their kitchen table, a map of the restaurant's ownership structure spread out before them. The tip they received pointed to connections, deep, unspoken connections between the restaurant and individuals in power in the town. These weren't just isolated acts of discrimination. No, this was part of a broader, more insidious culture of exclusion that went beyond the restaurant's doors. They had unearthed something far darker than they'd anticipated, and now they had to decide how to proceed. Each of them had their own way of processing the situation. One member wanted to go public immediately, post everything online, and let the world know about the connections they'd uncovered. Another member, more cautious, wanted to take a step back, carefully verify every lead before they acted. But no matter how they looked at it, the family knew one thing for sure: the road ahead was going to get a lot more complicated. As the days passed, they kept digging. The family's small circle of supporters grew, but so did the backlash. They began to receive anonymous threats, subtle but chilling. At first, they shrugged them off as empty words, just the typical intimidation tactics used to scare people into silence. But when one of them found their car keyed with a threatening message, they realized the stakes were much higher than they'd anticipated. They weren't just fighting an unfair denial of service anymore, they were challenging a system that had been built on years of secrecy and manipulation. One of the family members, always the one to keep their head down and stay out of spotlight, began to worry. They could feel the weight of the situation bearing down on them, like an invisible hand squeezing tighter and tighter with every passing day. The protest outside the restaurant had started to gain some attention, but the family knew it was only a matter of time before things escalated beyond their control. They had no idea just how far those in power were willing to go to protect their interests. The subplots began to weave together in ways they hadn't expected. One of the family's supporters, a local journalist with a history of investigating corruption, came to them with a story. The restaurant's owners had been involved in shady dealings with other businesses in the area, payoffs, bribes, and other illegal activities to keep their doors open and their reputation intact. The tip wasn't just about racial discrimination, it was about a deeper, more dangerous conspiracy that reached far beyond the town. But the journalist warned them, if they pursued this story, they were putting not just themselves, but their entire community at risk. Tension hung in the air as the family debated their next steps. Do they take the journalist's story and expose the full extent of the corruption, knowing it could shatter the town's delicate balance? Or do they focus on the fight at hand, the wrong that had been done to them and their community? No matter how they looked at it, there was no simple answer. Both paths would be dangerous, and neither came without consequences. Meanwhile, the restaurant, seemingly unfazed by the protests, began to turn its attention to the family. They were no longer just a nuisance, they had become a threat. Inside the walls of the restaurant, the owners were holding secret meetings, plotting their next move. They knew that the family had the potential to expose everything they had worked so hard to cover up, and they were willing to do anything to protect their interests. The atmosphere was charged with fear and paranoia. The family's investigation wasn't just a matter of justice anymore, it was a full-blown war between two forces, and no one knew who would come out on top. As the days passed, the family felt the pressure mounting from all sides. The community was split. Some rallied behind them, sharing their story and demanding justice, while others whispered behind closed doors, afraid of the potential fallout. In a small town like theirs, where everyone knew everyone else, even a whisper could become a roar. The family couldn't help but wonder who in their own circle might be working against them. It was difficult to trust anyone anymore. And then there was the growing strain within the family itself. What started as a united front was beginning to show cracks. The pressure, the constant stress, the threats, everything was starting to take its toll. Tensions flared as they disagreed on how best to move forward. Should they expose everything, risking their safety and their community's peace? Or should they focus on a more direct approach, one that might get them results but risked escalating things even further? With each passing day, the family seemed to be growing further apart, each member struggling to hold on to their own sense of conviction, while still trying to keep the unity they had once shared. The emotional toll was undeniable. The youngest family member, who had first spoken up about not letting the incident go unnoticed, started to feel the weight of their decision. What began as a hopeful determination to right a wrong now felt more like a burden, something that might consume them entirely. They questioned whether they were doing the right thing, wondering if the fight was worth the cost. They saw the fear in their family's eyes, the fatigue that was settling in, and they couldn't help but wonder if they had led everyone down this path without fully understanding the consequences. Despite the growing internal struggles, there was no turning back. The family had come too far to back down now. They had to press forward, even though the road ahead was filled with uncertainty. They knew there were risks, physical, emotional, and even legal, but the drive for justice was powerful. It burned inside them, pushing them forward, even when it felt like everything else was falling apart. And then came the phone call. A mysterious voice on the other end claimed to know everything about the family's investigation. The person said they had information that could blow the entire case wide open. But there was a catch: they wouldn't reveal anything unless the family agreed to meet in person, in a secluded location, far from anyone's watchful eyes. The decision weighed heavily on them. Was this a trap? Or was this the break they had been waiting for? The tension in the family grew thicker, their future uncertain. As they prepared to meet this mysterious source, they could feel the walls closing in, the danger rising with every passing second. Would they uncover the truth, or would they be walking into something far darker than they had ever imagined? The clock was ticking, and they had no idea what the next turn in their journey would bring. The day of the meeting with the mysterious source had arrived, and the air was thick with the sense of impending danger. The family's decision to go had been a hard one, each member torn between the hope that this could finally bring the answers they needed and the fear that they were walking right into a trap. Every step felt like it was leading them deeper into a web of uncertainty. A place where they no longer knew who could be trusted. They had no choice but to proceed. The answers they sought were just out of reach, and this was their best shot at uncovering the truth. As they drove to the secluded location, the silence in the car was suffocating. The only sound was the tires on the road, a constant reminder of how far they had come and how far they were willing to go. They had agreed to meet at an old, abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town, a place where no one would hear them if things went wrong. The family could feel the weight of their decision hanging over them, each one battling their own doubts, their own fears. When they arrived, the tension only deepened. The area was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that made the family feel like they were being watched. Shadows crept along the ground as they pulled up, the building looming in front of them like something out of a nightmare. They parked their car far enough away to remain hidden, but close enough to make a quick getaway if needed. Everyone's eyes flicked nervously between each other, and yet, there was a shared resolve that held them together. They had come too far to turn back now. One of the family members, the most cautious of the group, checked the time. The meeting was supposed to happen in 5 minutes, but no one had seen the mysterious person yet. The minutes ticked by, each one stretching longer than the last. Just as doubt began to creep in, the sound of footsteps echoed from behind the warehouse, and a figure emerged from the shadows. The figure was tall, cloaked in a dark hoodie, their face obscured by the hood. They approached with deliberate steps, and the family tensed. No words were exchanged as the figure motioned for them to follow, leading them toward the warehouse entrance. The air seemed to grow colder as they moved deeper into the shadows, the warehouse looming like a silent witness to whatever was about to unfold. Inside, the place smelled musty, abandoned, as if it had been untouched for years. There were no windows, only dim light filtering through cracks in the walls. The figure led them further into the building, their footsteps echoing on the cement floor, and the family's anxiety only heightened. Every instinct screamed at them to turn back, but they couldn't. This was it. This was the moment that could change everything. The figure stopped abruptly in the middle of the warehouse, and without a word, turned to face them. The family stood there, frozen, waiting for them to speak. The silence stretched on, thick and uncomfortable, as the figure slowly pulled back their hood. When their face was revealed, the family gasped in shock. It wasn't someone they expected. It was someone they knew. A familiar face, someone they trusted, someone who had been around for years. The realization hit like a thunderclap. This person had been involved in the very system they were trying to expose. They had been a part of the conspiracy all along. The figure smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "You think you're fighting for justice," they said, their voice cold and flat. "But you're just pawns in a game much bigger than you can comprehend." The family recoiled, stunned by the betrayal. How could they have been so blind? This person had been so close to them, someone they trusted without question. And now they were standing in front of them, admitting to their involvement in the very corruption they were trying to uncover. The pieces started to fall into place, but with each revelation, the situation grew more dangerous. It was no longer just about exposing a restaurant's wrongdoings. It was about taking on a network of power that ran deeper than they could have ever imagined. As the figure spoke, they revealed more hidden connections, secret meetings, and payoffs that had been going on right under their noses. They explained how the town's leaders, including some of the most respected figures in the community, had been complicit in perpetuating the system of inequality. They had used their influence to ensure that things stayed the way they were. The family had stumbled onto something much bigger than they had realized, and now they were in too deep. But the figure's words weren't just a warning. They were a threat. The message was clear: if the family continued down this path, if they pushed any further, there would be consequences. The network of people behind the corruption wasn't going to let anyone expose them without a fight. And they had the power to make the family's lives a living nightmare. The figure gave them one final ultimatum: walk away now, or face the consequences. There's still time to turn back. You've done enough damage already. The coldness in their tone made it clear that they weren't offering a real choice, they were threatening them, trying to scare them into submission. But the family, despite the fear rising in their chests, stood their ground. They couldn't back down now. Not after everything they'd uncovered. Not after everything they'd fought for. But before they could respond, the sound of a car engine revving in the distance cut through the tension, followed by the harsh screech of tires on gravel. The figure's eyes flickered with alarm, and for a split second, they looked almost vulnerable, as if something had shifted in the dynamic. In that moment of distraction, the family's resolve hardened. They knew the stakes were higher than ever, but they were ready. The confrontation was no longer about proving a point. It was about survival. They had no idea who was coming, but one thing was clear: they weren't the only ones who knew about the family's investigation. The figure looked at them one last time, their gaze dark with a mix of anger and fear. "You don't know what you're up against," they said, before quickly turning and vanishing into the shadows. The family was left standing in the dim light of the warehouse, the sound of approaching vehicles growing louder by the second. The question that loomed now was whether they would survive this, whether they would be able to uncover the truth and expose it before those in power could silence them for good. The clock was ticking. The final showdown was almost here, and the family was caught in the middle of a battle that no one could have predicted. What would happen next? Would they finally expose the corruption, or would they be swallowed by the very system they sought to destroy? The tension was unbearable, and the next move was theirs to make. The family stood frozen in the abandoned warehouse, the engine noise from the approaching vehicles now deafening. Fear gnawed at them, but there was no time to think. Every instinct screamed for them to act, to move, to get out of the open. As the sound grew closer, it became clear that the moment they'd feared was upon them. There was no escape now. They had crossed a line, and those in power were coming to ensure it didn't go any further. The figure who had warned them was gone, vanished into the shadows. But their message lingered, heavy and haunting. As the family huddled together, trying to make sense of their next move, a harsh voice suddenly echoed from behind them. "Thought you could take down the system, did you?" The family spun around, eyes wide with shock, but no one was there. It was as if the voice came from the very walls around them, the air vibrating with the intensity of the words. The room felt colder, like a presence had entered, something darker, something watching. Then, like a veil lifting, the truth hit them: they weren't alone. In the corner of the warehouse, partially obscured in the shadows, was a figure they hadn't seen coming, a figure they thought they had left behind, someone they trusted more than anyone. The family's eyes locked onto the figure as recognition dawned. It was someone close to them, someone who had been at their side throughout the entire ordeal. Someone they believed had been just as committed to the cause. But now, standing in front of them, the person wasn't the ally they'd once thought. They were a part of the very system they were fighting against. A sense of betrayal washed over them, almost suffocating. The person had been feeding them information, yes, but it wasn't the truth. They had been planted in their midst all along, a mole who had been steering them toward the wrong conclusions. Every move they had made, every lead they'd followed, had been carefully orchestrated. The fight they thought was about justice had been nothing more than a game to this person, a way to lead them down a path that would, in the end, protect the very system they had hoped to tear down. "You should have known," the figure said with a bitter smile. "You think it's just about some restaurant?" This is bigger than you could ever imagine. You were never supposed to uncover this. The family recoiled, their hearts heavy with the weight of the revelation. The person they had trusted, the one who had been a pillar in their fight, had been playing them from the very beginning. Their hope, their mission, had been twisted into something unrecognizable. The figure stepped forward, revealing their true allegiance. They were no innocent bystander. They were a key player in the conspiracy, and they had been feeding misinformation to misdirect the family's investigation. You were meant to think the restaurant was the root of the problem, the figure continued, but the truth is far more dangerous. The corruption runs much deeper, and you've stumbled into something that can't be undone. You can't expose it. Not anymore. The words hit like a physical blow. Everything they had worked for, all the sleepless nights, the countless hours of research, the risks they'd taken, had it all been for nothing? Had they been nothing more than pawns in a larger game? The family was silent, processing the weight of what they'd just learned. The figure, sensing their shock, pressed on. You think you're the first ones to try and bring it down? There's a reason no one has succeeded. The system is too powerful. Too well guarded. And now? Well, now you've gone too far. Before they could respond, the sound of heavy footsteps approached from behind them. More figures, emerging from the shadows, each face filled with an unsettling sense of determination. They were trapped. The family had walked right into the heart of the storm, and now, it seemed, there was no way out. But just as the tension reached its peak, an unexpected sound, an urgent beep, broke through the suffocating silence. A phone. One of the family members, clutching it in a trembling hand, checked the screen. A new message flashed across the display, its content brief but heavy. They know you're here. Get out. Now. For a split second, everything stopped. The person in front of them, the ones who had just exposed their betrayal, seemed momentarily thrown off guard. Their eyes flicked to the family member holding the phone, their expression shifting from smug confidence to a brief flash of panic. It was enough to ignite a surge of adrenaline in the family. This wasn't the end, not yet. The message had come from an unknown number, but it was clear someone else knew what was going on, someone with power, someone who was watching over them from the shadows. The thought of a potential ally, a hidden force on their side, was enough to shift the balance. They had to act. But they had no time. The danger was closing in, and every second felt like an eternity. The family's instincts kicked in. The room that had felt like a prison just moments before now seemed like a battleground. The next move was critical, and they had no choice but to trust the message. Whatever it meant, whoever was sending it, it was their best chance. Without a word, they turned toward the nearest exit, their bodies moving as one, every step quick and decisive. They couldn't afford to hesitate. But as they reached the door, the familiar face, the figure they once trusted, called out behind them, a final, chilling reminder of what was at stake. You think you can just walk away? You've already made your choice. There's no turning back now. The family didn't stop. They couldn't afford to. The chase was on. The question was no longer just about exposing the truth. It was about survival. Who was on their side? Who could they trust? And how much further would those in power go to silence them? The air outside was cold, the night dark and heavy with uncertainty. The family's hearts pounded in their chests as they disappeared into the shadows, the sound of footsteps still echoing behind them. They didn't know what was waiting for them, but one thing was clear: the fight was far from over. The climax was approaching fast, and they were at the center of it all. The cold air outside bit at their skin as the family sprinted down the alley, the distant sound of footsteps still echoing in the darkness behind them. They had barely made it out of the warehouse, but they knew it wasn't over. Whoever had been watching them, whoever had been pulling the strings, was not going to let them go so easily. The family's hearts pounded, their breaths coming in sharp gasps as they rounded a corner, praying they hadn't been followed. They had no plan, no backup, only the message they'd received and the hope that someone, somewhere, was still on their side. Just as they slowed to catch their breath, a car's headlights flickered in the distance. The moment they saw the lights, their fear spiked. Was it someone from the conspiracy coming after them? Or was it the ally they'd been hoping for? They had no time to wonder. The car was speeding towards them, and in a split second, it skidded to a stop right in front of them. A figure stepped out from the car, and it was someone none of them had expected to see. It was the person who had been part of their investigation from the very beginning, the one who had provided the key information, the one who seemed trustworthy, and who had given them the final push to move forward. The family froze, unsure whether to trust them or run in the opposite direction. But the urgency in the person's eyes was enough to make them hesitate. "Get in the car," the figure ordered, their voice sharp. "You don't have much time." There was no time to question, no time to argue. With one last glance at each other, the family piled into the car, and the figure slammed the door shut behind them. The engine roared to life, and they sped off, leaving the shadows of the alley behind. As the car raced down the street, the figure didn't speak. The family remained tense, unsure of what was happening or who they could trust anymore. They glanced out the windows, half expecting to see headlights following them, but nothing came. The silence inside the car felt oppressive. Their minds raced with questions, but no one dared to ask. What was going on? Was this person really on their side? Or had they just traded one danger for another? The figure drove them through winding streets, taking them farther away from the warehouse and deeper into an area they didn't recognize. The scenery grew more unfamiliar, and anxiety started to build once again. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the car slowed and turned into a secluded driveway. A tall, looming building came into view, hidden from the main road by trees and thick foliage. The family exchanged nervous glances. Where were they now? What was this place? The figure turned off the engine and faced them. "This is the safe house," they said, their voice low and urgent. "You're not safe yet. But you will be here." The family didn't know whether to believe them. The weight of everything they'd just learned, the betrayal, the threats, the entire conspiracy was pressing down on them, and they couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. This place seemed too quiet, too perfect. The family stepped out of the car, each member feeling more exposed than ever. The figure led them into the building, a large, dark house with no signs of life, just shadows stretching along the walls and the heavy, ominous air of something hidden beneath the surface. As they moved inside, the family couldn't help but feel the strange sense that they were walking into a trap. They had come this far, but now they felt more vulnerable than ever. The door shut behind them with a resounding thud, echoing through the empty space. And then, just as they started to breathe a little easier, it happened. The figure turned to face them, a cold smirk spreading across their face. The family's stomachs dropped, and their bodies tensed. In an instant, everything shifted. The person who had seemed like their ally, their savior, was now revealed to be the very thing they had feared, a part of the conspiracy all along. The final twist came with terrifying clarity. This was all part of the plan. They had led the family here, not to protect them, but to silence them. "You should have listened when I told you to back off," the figure said, their voice taking on a dangerous edge. "Now you're too deep. And there's no way out." The family's eyes widened in shock, the pieces falling into place with a sickening realization. The messages, the help, the guidance, they had all been carefully crafted to bring them here, to this moment. The safe house wasn't a refuge, it was a trap. There was no one who had been on their side. Everyone they had trusted was either part of the conspiracy or playing both sides. As the figure stepped closer, they revealed the final shocking truth: the entire town, from the restaurant to the officials to the people who had seemed like allies, was in on it. They were all part of a system that manipulated the town, its people, and everything in between. The family had thought they were fighting for justice, but they had unknowingly been playing into a game far bigger and darker than they could have ever imagined. Just when it seemed like everything was lost, the ground beneath them shifted. A faint noise came from the shadows of the room, and another figure stepped out, this time more familiar than the first. It was someone they had once trusted completely, someone who had disappeared after the initial investigation, someone who had warned them to be careful. The family's breath caught as the figure revealed the true depth of the conspiracy, and what they were willing to risk to destroy it once and for all. "I've been working behind the scenes," the second figure said, stepping into the light. "I couldn't let you know until it was safe, but we've been planning this for months. The end is near. Trust me, we're not done." But before they could hear more, the first figure turned to the second, eyes narrowing. "You betrayed us." A deadly silence filled the room, a standoff brewing between the two figures, each representing a different side of the war that had been quietly raging beneath the surface. For a split second, the tension was unbearable. And then, just like that, the lights went out. In the darkness, there was a sound, something sharp, followed by a gasp, and then silence. When the lights flickered back on, everything had changed. The second figure was gone. The first was left standing, their face filled with disbelief and shock. It wasn't over. The family realized, in that moment, they were caught in a battle that no one would win without bloodshed. The final twist, who had betrayed whom? Who was truly on their side? Would remain unanswered for now, as the family was forced to make their move before it was too late. One thing was certain, their fight for justice was far from over. It had only just begun. The flickering of the lights cast long shadows across the room, the air heavy with tension and the scent of something ominous lingering in the dark. The family stood frozen, unsure of what had just happened. The second figure was gone, vanished without a trace, and the first figure, once an ally, now an enemy, was left in the middle of the room, staring at the spot where their former partner had been moments before. A silence hung between them, thick and suffocating. The family's hearts were pounding, the weight of everything they had uncovered pressing down on them with a force they could barely comprehend. Then, without a word, the first figure turned and began to walk toward the exit. They moved like someone who had accepted their fate, as if the game was finally over, and there was no point in pretending anymore. The family hesitated for a moment, wondering if this was their chance to escape. But something about the way the figure moved, their posture, the calmness in their steps told them that whatever was about to happen, they weren't going to get away without a fight. "Are you just going to walk away?" one of them asked, their voice shaky but determined. They needed answers, and they needed them now. The figure stopped just short of the door, their hand resting on the doorknob. They didn't turn around but spoke with a coldness that made the family's blood run cold. "You don't understand. You never did. You were never meant to. This is bigger than you." "What is?" another family member pressed, their voice louder now. "What is all of this about? Why lead us on this wild goose chase? You had us all fooled." The figure's head turned just slightly, their lips curling into a bitter smile. "You think you've won? You think you've uncovered the truth? No, you've only scratched the surface. The real players. They're watching you right now, and they'll decide what happens next." With that, the figure swung the door open, stepping out into the dark hallway. The family exchanged uneasy glances, their nerves at an all-time high. There was no more running. There was no more hiding. The truth had been laid bare, and they were standing at the precipice of something much bigger than they could have ever imagined. The family followed the figure, unsure of what to expect next. They moved through the hallways, their footsteps echoing in the eerie silence. It was clear that the building wasn't just a safe house, it was a prison. They had been lured into this place with the promise of safety, only to find themselves trapped in a web of deceit and manipulation. They had been pawns, and now, They had no choice but to play the final hand. As they stepped into a larger room, the figure finally turned around, locking eyes with each of them. There was no more pretense, no more games. The truth was finally on the table. "This is the last chance," the figure said, their voice now tinged with a sense of finality. "You have to make a choice. You can either walk away, forget everything, live your life as you were meant to, or you can fight. But know this, if you fight, you're not just fighting for yourselves. You're fighting for everyone who's been silenced, for everyone who's been crushed under the weight of a system that's been in power for generations. You'll be going up against forces you can't even begin to understand." The family stood still, each of them processing what had been said. For a moment, everything seemed to stop. They could feel the weight of the decision hanging over them, knowing that no matter which path they chose, it would change their lives forever. The consequences of their actions would ripple out, affecting not just them but everyone they cared about. It was a crossroads, and they knew that whatever happened next would be irreversible. One by one, they glanced at each other. The uncertainty in the room was palpable. They had come so far, risked so much, but was it enough? Were they strong enough to face what lay ahead? The first family member stepped forward, their expression set with resolve. "We didn't come this far just to turn back now. We've seen what's at stake, and we're not going to back down." The second followed, their voice unwavering. "We fight for what's right. We fight for the truth. We fight because if we don't, no one will." The third, with a grim look, nodded. "This is bigger than us. But we can't let them win." It was unanimous. They were in it together, no matter the cost. They knew what they had to do, even if it meant losing everything in the process. They had uncovered the depths of a corrupt system, and now it was time to tear it down. The stakes had never been higher. The figure watched them for a moment, their expression unreadable. Then, without a word, they nodded and motioned for them to follow. It was time. They moved quickly, moving through the house, past hallways and darkened rooms. The tension in the air was palpable. Every step they took brought them closer to the heart of the conspiracy, and every step was filled with the knowledge that danger could strike at any moment. They had no illusions left. This wasn't a fight they could win easily. The road ahead would be long, filled with uncertainty and treachery at every turn. But they were ready. As they approached a large door at the end of the hallway, the figure paused. "Once we go through this door, there's no turning back," they said. "Are you sure you're ready?" The family exchanged one last look. They were terrified, yes. But they knew what they had to do. They had come too far to stop now. With a deep breath, they nodded. The figure opened the door, revealing a room filled with monitors and technology. At the far end of the room stood a massive screen, displaying images of the family from moments ago, everything they had done, everything they had uncovered. It was clear that they were being watched at every turn. In front of the monitors, a group of people sat, shadowy figures, faces obscured, but their presence unmistakable. These were the ones who had been pulling the strings all along. The people behind the conspiracy. The ones who had orchestrated everything. "You've made it this far," one of the figures said, their voice smooth and confident. "But this is where your journey ends." The family felt a surge of fear and anger, but they didn't flinch. They had made their choice, and they weren't going to let anyone stop them now. "We didn't come here to beg for mercy," one of them said, stepping forward. "We came here to take you down." There was a moment of silence, and then the room erupted into chaos. But it wasn't the chaos they expected. The monitors flickered, and the figures at the control desk scrambled. The walls buzzed with the sound of alarms and flashing lights, and suddenly, the room was filled with people, their allies, the ones who had been waiting for this moment. It was a trap, but not for them. The family had known they were being watched. They had known that the final showdown was coming. And now, They had their chance to take down the system once and for all. The room was filled with a mixture of fear and hope, the weight of their actions finally catching up with them. They weren't just fighting for justice anymore, they were fighting for their survival. The final battle was fierce. It was a fight against the system that had kept them in the dark for so long. But in the end, it was the family's determination, their refusal to back down, that won out. The figures at the control desk were overwhelmed, and the system they had fought so hard to protect came crashing down. As the dust settled, the family stood victorious. But it was a bittersweet victory. They had fought for the truth, but the cost had been high. They had lost allies, they had faced betrayal, and they had been pushed to their limits. But in the end, they had won. And as they walked away from the wreckage of the system, they knew that their fight wasn't over. There was still much to be done. But for now, they had achieved the impossible. And it was enough.